Hey there, interwebs, and welcome back to Russell's Guide to Monsters. 2 years ago today, I uploaded the first episode in the series as a special Halloween video, because monsters. Now I want to do something in the Halloween spirit once again, but 10 episodes of hybrid creatures have cost them some of their fear factor. I have to find monsters which are even spookier than normal, but what could those be? How about the undead? This includes, but certainly isn't limited to, vampires, mummies, zombies, skellies, specters, ghouls, ghosts, wraiths, revenants, wights, werewolves occasionally, and very decidedly not flesh golems a la Frankenstein's monster, but I'll get to him anyway just because. Let's start with the most obvious creature to spring to mind whenever someone mentions the undead, zombies. You know zombies, people raised from the dead by voodoo or other black magic who go around biting people and infecting them or outright eating them, arms held straight out in front of them moaning brains, and which can only be killed by removing the head or destroying the brain. Except you almost never find a zombie which conforms to this definition 100%. There are also many, many works which functionally have zombies, but which purists will argue aren't technically zombies. If the qualifications are optional, or at least nebulous, then what makes a zombie? As far as Western culture, by which I mean me and the half-dozen people I asked, is concerned, the original zombies, or OZs if you will, come from the classic, the iconic, film by George Romero, Night of the Living Dead. Two of recent television's biggest franchises to feature zombies are The Walking Dead and Game of Thrones, and interestingly, none of these three works ever use the word zombie. The screenplay for Night of the Living Dead refers to them as ghouls, but I'll get to what a ghoul is later in this video. These three works aren't alone in their aversion to the word either, but it doesn't matter if you call them ghouls, wraiths, wights, walkers, white walkers, clickers, or the differently alive. Whatever pretentious name you want to give your zombies, they're still going to be zombies, and fundamentally they can be broken down into two groups. The truly undead, and the still technically alive but just infected. For the purposes of this video, I don't care about the second kind. Because we're not counting infection-based zombies as true undead, there are really only two methods in fiction by which to create zombies: magic and technology. The technology, however, would have to be so advanced that in accordance with Clarke's third law, it would functionally be magic. Magic is also where the original zombies of mythology come from, although they differ from modern zombies in several important ways. For the uninitiated, the name and concept of zombies originates with Haitian voodoo, which is what you get when you syncretize traditional West African folk beliefs with some good old-fashioned Roman Catholicism. In this hybrid belief system, it is claimed that a type of shaman or sorcerer known as a bakor can use a sort of necromantic witchcraft to bring people back from the grave as unthinking undead slaves. These zombies are then under the complete control of the bakor and will act accordingly. They really only go feral and develop cannibalistic cravings when and if the bakor is killed or otherwise loses control over them. They can also be freed from this spell by salt, of all things. Harvard ethnobotanist Wade Davis put forward a theory in the 1980s that these beliefs may be grounded in reality, and suggested that unscrupulous witch doctors use tetrodotoxin derived from pufferfish poison to put their potential zombie victims into a death-like state of suspended animation before exhuming the still-living bodies and controlling them with pharmacologically augmented hypnosis for periods of several years. This theory, however, has since lost much of its initial credibility within the academic community, since the symptoms of tetrodotoxin poisoning do not include many of the alleged traits of zombies, and chemical analysis of his collected samples failed to support his claims of their powers. Wow, that was a mouthful. I could say more about these supposed voodoo zombies and the numerous West African belief systems which contributed to the idea, but this video isn't a comprehensive deep dive on zombies, nor comparative theology, so let's move on to some of their other popular traits. Zombies always go brains. It's their catchphrase. Everybody knows this. But can you name any work you have seen, read, listened to, whatever, wherein the zombies actually say brains, and that wasn't a deliberate parody or deconstruction? Romero's Night of the Living Dead was released in 1968, and it wasn't until 1985 that we got the first appearance of brains in The Return of the Living Dead. That's a comedy film, and it shouldn't be confused with the novel of the same name by John Russo. The novel is a sequel to the novelization of Night of the Living Dead, and Russo co-wrote the film Night of the Living Dead with Romero. The film Return of the Living Dead is also a sequel of sorts to Night of the Living Dead, based on the premise that the movie was based on actual events, and the government allowed the film to be made but ordered the filmmakers to alter the story and claim it was fictional. And, just in case it wasn't confusing enough already, The Return of the Living Dead also has a novelization, also written by John Russo. The important part is that the Return of the Living Dead film is a horror comedy, and just about every use of brains since then has been a reference or homage to it, whether intentional or not. I keep coming back to Night of the Living Dead because, as I mentioned before, it's basically the granddaddy of the whole zombie genre. The The thing is, that's more or less by accident, because the film's distributor forgot to copyright it. You see, it was originally called Night of the Flesh Eaters, and the copyright notice was posted on the title card for the theatrical prints, but when the title was changed to Living Dead, they forgot to re-include the notice, which caused the film to immediately enter the public domain. This mistake cost Romero incalculable millions in royalties, but on the other hand it caused the film's popularity to skyrocket, since anyone could now legally show it for free, propelling it to its modern status as a classic horror film. Most zombies these days essentially mix and match their traits from the Romero and Russo canons, which can lead to the occasional head-scratcher. For example, brains are a zombie staple. If you want to kill them, you have to cut off their head, removing the brain, or otherwise destroy it. Brains are also a dietary staple, sometimes. In the Russo canon, they crave brain food, literally, but in other settings they'll settle for any flesh they can get their teeth in. Some settings also establish that zombism, can be contracted by being bitten by one. Do you see the issue? If being bitten by a zombie turns you into one, and zombies will eat your brain, and destroying its brain kills a zombie, then it seems like a zombie pandemic is a self-correcting issue. Much like an incredibly deadly disease which kills its hosts before they have a chance to spread it, zombies eliminate their own victims before they have a chance to become other zombies. If you want a proper zombie plague, stick to only 2 of the 3. And speaking of brains and creating more zombies, in my fantasy setting, when a necromancer raises one, its level of sapience and self-awareness can vary anywhere on the spectrum from an unthinking, undead slave beholden to the master's every command, all the way up to full restoration of the deceased's memories and personality. How much the zombie receives is decided by the necromancer at the time the spell is cast, but it's also limited by how well preserved the zombie's brain is, both magically and in more mundane ways. That being said, no matter how well a corpse is preserved, it will almost always decay down to a naked skeleton. These are our next type of undead to examine, but there's not much to look at. It's pretty bare bones. No, I'm not apologizing for that one. Deal with it. Skeletons are, by my reckoning, basically just normal zombies in an advanced state of decomposition, and this seems to work as many of the same rules apply to both groups. They're both undead, resurrected or reanimated by necromantic magic of one kind or another, and often behave in very similar ways. One of the weirdest differences between the two is that skeletons, on average, actually seem to be smarter than their fleshier relatives. This is evidenced by their frequent use of weapons, whereas zombies tend to stick to biting and scratching. Like my cat. Zombies also tend to form hordes en masse, whereas skeletons sometimes employ formation tactics and pick their targets. Incidentally, Ezekiel 37:1-10 is all about God creating an army of reanimated skeletons, and this passage is what inspired the iconic skeleton song, Dem Bones. There is, however, one skeleton of note who definitely isn't a zombie. It isn't even undead. That's because it's death itself. Death, the fourth horseman, the Black Wanderer, the Destroying Angel, everyone's favorite psychopomp, the Grim Reaper. Sorry, Hermes. Of course, since death itself is neither dead nor undead, it doesn't have a place in this video. Better luck next time, old friend. Another type of very powerful skeleton, or some kind of undead, is the Lich, which is an undead magic user, and before you ask, yes, Dungeons & Dragons was the first work to pair the name with the concept. The name comes from the Old English word for corpse, and these post-mortem mages are generally wizards who use necromancy to transcend death and become, in a way, immortal. Unlike zombies and some skeletons, liches are still fully sapient and get to keep their previous mental and magical powers. Oftentimes they can even create lesser undead soldiers and servants like traditional zombies. Perhaps a lich's biggest vulnerability is its phylactery, a sort of magical soul jar which it can use to regenerate if its body is damaged, but which if destroyed will destroy the lich along with it. Some people might tell you not to use the word phylactery in the context of liches, citing it as a sacred religious item in Judaism and marking its use in fantasy as a form of cultural appropriation. I have 3 things to say about that. 1. All of human history is one long culture of appropriation. Ever since the dawn of humanity, we've been looking at the next tribe over and saying, oh, that's a cool idea, let's use it ourselves. Yoink. 2. I may only be culturally Jewish, but I don't have a problem with this use of phylactery. Words can have more than one meaning, and anyone who's going to confuse a real-world religious object with the soul jar of an undead wizard is a moron. As far as I care, you can call it any name you want. And 3, even setting aside its use in fantasy, the word phylactery can refer to things other than the tefillin, which is, by the way, the Hebrew name for it. Phylactery comes from the ancient Greek word phylakterion, which basically just means protection thingy, and it can refer to an amulet or charm, worn for its preternatural powers of protection, or a scroll in medieval art which contains or represents speech. Sorry, went off on a bit of a tangent there, so let's get back to ghouls, which I promised you earlier. The English word ghoul comes via French from the Arabic word for demon, ghoul. See also Resh al-Ghul, meaning the demon's head, or more literally, head of the demon. The Arabic word ghoul comes from their word gala, which means to seize. They were originally monstrous creatures of pre-Islamic Arabian mythology associated with cemeteries, and, according to some, they were demons inhabiting, or seizing, the bodies of the deceased. It's also a common trait in many tellings for them to consume human flesh, which they either scavenge from graves or acquire by luring the living into an uninhabited place and then slaying them. Following logically on from that, the term is also sometimes used in Arabic to describe a gluttonous or otherwise greedy individual. When you combine their cadaverous incarnation and residence in cemeteries with their humanitarian diet, it's easy to see how the image of them as zombie-like creatures came about. In other versions of the myth, ghouls are shapeshifters, taking on the form of the last person they consumed, rather than physically inhabiting the bodies of the deceased. In Islamic theology, some believe ghouls to be devils or shayatin, burned by comets and driven insane, while others consider them to be a subclass of jinn who can be converted if you recite the verse of the throne at them. Okay, so that's ghouls taken care of, which brings me to ghosts. This one's actually pretty easy, so long as we stick to the surface of what is really a very deep topic. Your basic ghost is the soul, spirit, or otherwise disembodied consciousness of a deceased person. It is, in essence, the incorporeal part of a person's existence, like a mind without a body, literally. That being said, such a thing won't always stop a ghost from interfering with the physical world. Some ghosts can cause drafts or muck with the lights, while others like to knock things off of elevated surfaces. Again, like my cat. Some ghosts can even inhabit the bodies of the living, temporarily taking possession of them. Keep that in mind, because I'll come back to it in a little bit. Just as their level of intangibility varies by setting, so too does their visibility. Oftentimes they're invisible, or able to switch between completely invisible and merely translucent at will. When they are at least partly visible, they'll usually look however they looked in life, but maybe with a wispy, tapering tail. Or a bedsheet. Actually, the bedsheet ghost is a bit of a dead horse luck these days, no pun intended, but where did it come from in the first place? In 2 words, funeral shrouds. In slightly more words, artists, illustrators, and people putting on stage productions of ghost stories back in the day needed a quick way to visually inform their audiences that certain characters were spirits of the deceased. One solution was to have the characters show up wearing the clothing, and more importantly, the shroud in which they were buried, and these just happened to bear a resemblance to 21st century sheets. As modern Halloween traditions like trick-or-treating began to take off in the early 20th century, people needed costumes which were simple, spooky, and cheap. That last point became all the more important when the Great Depression rolled around in 1929, and so entered the bedsheet ghost. Of course, over time, the cheap look of the costume came to overpower people's frugality, and at a certain point there was just no avoiding the fact that the person who was allegedly a ghost was clearly just a dude draped in some spare bedding, and the look is now almost exclusively played for laughs or deliberately subverted. A creature which may or may not be a ghost is a banshee. Personally, I say it's not. It's a fey creature, just one without a physical presence. The name even comes from the old Irish term for fairy woman, and these exclusively female spirits herald the death of family members by wailing, screeching, or keening. That last one is another type of high-pitched lamentation, although it's usually more melodic than your standard run-of-the-mill morning shriek. Look it up on your own time. Banshees are kind of like Gorgons, aka Medusas, in that their exact powers have mutated in recent tellings. Originally, Medusa was so hideous that just gazing upon her would turn you to stone, but that has since changed to give her the petrifying gaze instead. Well, it used to be that a banshee's wail was her mourning someone's imminent death, but now it has become a lethal sonic attack, because let's face it, that's a lot cooler. As far as appearances go, banshees can look like cockatrices, but only according to Banshee Winery. They can sometimes be very tall, but are usually very short, and wear white or a grey cloak over a red dress. They have ghastly complexions, and their eyes are red and bloodshot from constantly crying. Yikes. If we treat banshees like fairies rather than ghosts, however, that would also disqualify them from being undead. Also related to ghosts are wraiths, and for most intents and purposes, the 2 words are basically synonyms which you can use interchangeably. One place where it serves to make a distinction is Lord of the Rings, because Middle-earth has both, and they do function slightly differently. Normal ghosts, inasmuch as any ghost is normal, are simply the restless spirits of the dead. The dead men of Dunharrow are a good example. These creatures are completely immaterial and incorporeal. As contrast, the ring wraiths, or just wraiths for short, are neither living nor dead, according to Aragorn, but they are still physical beings able to wear garments and wield weapons, even though their bodies have basically withered away to nil. If you're being more poetic, and I don't see why not, a wraith can also refer to a wisp or faint trace of something, like a thin wraith of aromatic smoke meandering in its snaking coils through the shafts of afternoon sunlight. In addition to specialized wraiths, Tolkien also helped to popularize the idea of white zombies. That's white, W-I-G-H-T, not the 1932 horror film White Zombie starring Bela Lugosi, who had just portrayed Dracula on screen the previous year. White Zombie is also considered to be the first feature-length zombie movie, but what about whites? The word itself comes from Middle English, where it simply meant person, being, or entity, so where did the connection to the undead come from? In the Fellowship of the Ring, the Barrow-wights were the bodies of long-deceased kings being inhabited by demons. Tolkien lifted the name from Morrison Magnuson's 1869 translation of the Icelandic Grettir's saga. In it, the word barrow-wight refers to the living corpse of a man in a burial mound known as a barrow, defending his residence from grave robbers and other trespassers. D&D, as well as other fantasy settings which followed, latched onto the idea of an animated corpse defending its tomb and grave goods, but dropped barrow from the name, and thus we ended up with wight as yet another generic term for the undead. Since it just means dude, it's also a good alternative to the word zombie if you as a creator wish to avoid cultural appropriation, but I think the zombie ship sailed 50 years ago. The original Icelandic name for barrow-wights, by the way, was Haugbúi, literally meaning mound dweller, so barrow-wight is actually a pretty close translation. The Haugbúi is a type of draugr, the Norse version of a revenant, and I've got more to say about those in a moment. The undead creature which I want to get to first, and which is more related to barrow-wights than you may at first assume, is the classic mummy, by which I mean the Lon Chaney Jr. Universal horror film version, not the real-life desiccated historical artifact version. Think about it. Both are undead, often some kind of former nobility, and mostly content to haunt their own burial structure to ensure that no one tries to nick any of their swag. Where they start to differ is that mummies usually have magic powers, such as the quintessential mummy's curse. Of course, that's not to say barrow-wights and other Haugbúi can't have magical powers. Tolkien's wights definitely had something supernatural going on, but wights in general tend to be more mundane in recent depictions. Mummies, meanwhile, have only gotten more awesome in ancient magical powers, especially following the success of the 1999 Brendan Fraser film. One typical such spell in their book is the ability to command local desert wildlife, especially scarab beetles, and that aforementioned book is the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Yes, it was a real-life thing. No, it is not a wizard's spell book, but don't let that stop you from having fun with the idea. Also, Medjed, the figure contained therein, is pretty obviously just a bedsheet ghost, which I find inexplicably hilarious. If we play up these magical powers even further, mummies begin to seem less like wights and more like liches. In addition to being undead spellcasters, both have been known to turn others into their undead servants and command legions of the disquiet dead. The major difference between the two is that mummies don't have phylacteries. Or do they? They have a lot of swanky loot in their tombs, and buried with them amongst all the golden baubles and cats are canopic jars. You've probably heard of, or at least seen these things before. They're usually carved limestone vessels with animal heads on the lids, and they contain a mummified person's preserved liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines. Now, I'm not suggesting that this set of 4 containers is a mummy's phylactery, and I've never seen them portrayed that way, but I am saying it'd be a cool way to combine mummies and liches, and I'm already using the concept in an urban fantasy novel I'm working on. Basically, this is me calling dibs. When they're not being creepy, mummies have been known to put the romance in necromancy. Yes, really. You don't see it too much these days, but there was once a time when it was practically commonplace for mummies to be an object of romantic and even sexual attraction. As a matter of fact, the first fictional mummies of the undead variety were almost exclusively female and served not as villains, but as love interests for the protagonists of their stories. Examples of these works include The Jewel of Seven Stars by Bram Stoker, The Ring of Thoth by Arthur Conan Doyle, and Smith and the Pharaohs by H. Rider Haggard. In the 19th and early 20th century, when these stories were written, seductive mummies were sort of a physical embodiment of the allure of exploration, and the romance between them and the protagonists represented the relationship between ancient cultures and the archaeologists rediscovering them, usually from France or Victorian Britain. Throw in a generous amount of colonial romanticism and the pervasive sexualization of exotic women, and bam, sexy mummy. I found a scholarly article which pretty well sums up the phenomenon, and it's linked in the description below. Their prevalence waned in the mid to late 20th century after the 1932 film starring Boris Karloff popularized the idea of mummies as monsters, but they've been making a comeback in more recent works in the role of the femme fatale, a character type which combines elements of both the seductress and the villain. Getting back to revenants now, these are just zombies with a purpose, or at the very least, a grudge. These deceased persons are usually murder victims, and they're so hell-bent on attaining vengeance that not even death itself can stop them, and that's a level of spite I aspire to. Interestingly, ghouls are demons inhabiting otherwise unclaimed corpses, but we also know that demons can take possession of the bodies of the still living, which is a trait shared by ghosts. When we consider these two facts together, I think it's safe to say that revenants are ghosts of the departed possessing their own deceased corpses, which would make them a sort of ghoul. They're usually self-aware, at least to the extent necessary to remember that they were wronged, and by whom. Sometimes, though, they aren't, and they're simply driven to pursue revenge against a certain person for reasons they can't recall. A revenant is also one of the possible results you may get after using salt on a traditional voodoo zombie, since once the spell is broken it may turn on its former master in a righteous rage. Less malevolent relevant revenants, and I dare you to say that one 3 times fast, may come about not as a product of rage and hate, but through true love. It seems that any emotion will cause the dead to rise, just as long as it's powerful enough. Incidentally, this is also how I'd recommend doing it if you wanted to create a spin-off sequel to Romeo and Juliet with zombies. That is, a spin-off to Romeo and Juliet with zombies that isn't warm bodies, which honestly wasn't terrible. It wasn't a perfect film, but hey, it's still a better love story than Twilight. And that brings us to vampires. I've actually already touched on them once before, in the Horny Devils episode, and in that video I also should have mentioned a certain vampire relative, but I didn't because I hadn't yet heard of them at the time. They're called estries, and they're kinda like succubi with some vampire and Lilith thrown in for good measure. They're bloodthirsty female demons of Jewish folklore, and like vampires they can also appear as beautiful humans or shapeshift into animals. They can also take on a more ethereal spirit form. The name comes from the French strix, meaning night owl, which is also where we get the Lilith connection. They're nocturnal creatures, but it's unknown if they're photosensitive, and unlike vampires, they can enter churches and receive healing from holy blessings, though blessing one, even unknowingly, is considered an evil act. They can also heal from their injuries by drinking the blood or eating the bread and salt of the one who injured them. Again with the salt, what gives? Anyway, estries have a fascinating weakness in that they can fly, but only if their hair is unbound. If it's tied in a ponytail, she's grounded. After killing one, her mouth must be filled with earth or she'll return to life. This can also be prevented by decapitation or incineration. Alright, with that bit of follow-up out of the way, I can now talk about vampires. But I won't. As previously mentioned, this is the second video in which they get a mention, and once again I'm going to say that they really deserve their own dedicated video. Thinking about it, the same is probably true for werewolves, but also zombies, ghosts, and arguably mummies. The thing is, there are just so many vampiric variants that it would be unfair to the whole hemiphagic clade to try to squeeze them all down into just one section of a larger video. That being said, there is one special type of vampire which I do want to mention here, but that's because I don't really consider it to be a true vampire. Chinese vampires, also known as hopping vampires or hopping corpses, and more accurately known as jiangshi, are undead creatures from Chinese folklore, obviously. They're called vampires over here in the West because they drink people's life forces like a vampire drinks blood, but they're closer to zombies, especially the more traditional kind raised from the dead by black magic to do someone's bidding. One can be created from a corpse raised from the dead by a Taoist magician or priest placing a paper talisman bearing magical words to its forehead. If this sounds familiar, remember the previous episode wherein we learned that, according to one version of the myth, a golem is animated by use of a shem, a piece of parchment bearing magical words placed in its head by a holy man. Traditionally, golems were sculpted from clay, but presumably this method also works if you make one from certain organic material. It seems to me that jiangshi are less like vampires and more like what D&D would call a flesh golem. Without a doubt, the most famous flesh golem, indeed the very one which inspired the concept in the first place, is Frankenstein's monster. Also known as Frankenstein's creation, it is, as the name implies, a creation made by everyone's favorite college dropout turned villain of his own story, Victor Frankenstein. He shouldn't be confused with another college dropout cum villain named Victor and parading around calling himself Dr. Doom. You know, for guys whose name means winner, they have a surprising track record of not succeeding. Regardless, Frankie's monster is sometimes referred to simply as Frankenstein, probably due to being the iconic character of the universal horror film of the same name. See also Count Orlok, aka Nosferatu. This really irritates some people, who will stubbornly insist that Frankenstein refers only to the creator, but for what it's worth, in the book, the creation considers himself to be Victor's son. He also refers to himself as Victor's Adam at one point, and so some people, myself included, prefer to call him Adam Frankenstein. In the words of Victor, it's alive! But according to D&D, no, it isn't. It isn't even undead. It's just a construct, a crude automaton of flesh, and I just found the name of my next death metal band. If you're unclear on the concept, a flesh golem is a humanoid entity constructed from bits and pieces of multiple corpses and animated by either magic or sufficiently advanced technology. They're usually visually distinguished from zombies by an abundance of stitches, and their piecemeal construction gives them a patchy coloration. Again, like my cat. Given that both flesh golems and traditional zombies are made from corpses, you may be wondering what the relevant distinction is, so allow me to give you an example to illustrate the difference between dead, undead, and construct. Frogs are living creatures, and this means that over time they will get old and eventually croak. If you were a wizard well versed in the school of necromancy, you could cast a spell which returns some of the dead frog's vitality without restoring it to life, making it undead. You don't need to be a wizard, however, to plug a couple of wires into the right spots and make its corpse kick by applying electrical pulses. You can even achieve a similar effect by sprinkling salt on exposed musculature. Hey, maybe this is where the idea of magic salt comes from in the myths. Furthermore, you could disassemble a bunch of freshly dead frogs, stitch all of their legs together in one many-footed mass, and wire it up, creating a horribly nightmarish robot of flailing batrachian appendages. I don't care to imagine why you'd want to, but you could. I'd also suggest calling this Lovecraftian horror a frog prince, in reference to the phenomenon known as the Rat King and the original fairy tale in which a prince is formed from the splattered viscera of a frog. Speaking of Lovecraftian horrors, Adam Frankenstein played a very early but formative role in the creation of the zombie genre as we know it today, regardless of whether or not he was actually undead himself. You see, H.P. Lovecraft's short story Herbert West, Reanimator, began, according to his own letters, as a parody of Mary Shelley's classic novel Frankenstein, or A Modern Prometheus, right down to the Samuel Coleridge references contained in both. It's also one of the first depictions we have of the undead as scientifically reanimated corpses with feral, uncontrollable behaviors. In addition to influencing, if not outright inventing modern zombies, Lovecraft also made good use of liches well before D&D cemented the term with his short story The Thing on the Doorstep. If you can get past some uncomfortable opinions about women and black people, they're both excellent horror stories and well worth a read. At this point you may be thinking to yourself that it's strange how flesh golems, which are so much like zombies, wights, and revenants, are not undead, but other creatures like ghosts, phantoms, and wraiths are. They don't even have bodies, and flesh golems are made up of several each. And then you've got your gray areas, like banshees and werewolves, no pun intended. It all raises the question, just what qualifies something to be undead? The earliest use of the term undead occurs in Bram Stoker's Dracula. In fact, The Undead was even its working title at one point, and it is this classic horror novel which popularized the word. Although it existed in English prior to that point, it was simply a synonym for alive, but Stoker used it only to refer to vampires. Broadening of the word's definition to include other creatures only came later. These days it refers to an entity which used to be alive, then died, but is dead no longer. Instead, magic allows it to continue performing some functions of the living, such as movement, while not exhibiting other signs of life, such as breathing or having a heartbeat. Beyond that, however, it's difficult to pin down a specific definition which does not exclude at least one other creature type generally considered to be undead. If you think you've got a good one, please leave it in the comments below, because I'm genuinely interested in finding a method of concrete categorization. Maybe if I find a really good one, it will inspire me to create a direct follow-up video. Artwork used in this video was created by John Korosh, Rich Burlew, Ted Naismith, Josh Burns, Rachel Versteeg, Matthew Stock, Trudy Cooper, Doug Bain, Beth Hansen Booth, Genghis Kron, Zach Wiener Smith, Scott Fensterer, Rob Saccheto, Mike Hill, and Chris Bjors. Until next time, thanks for watching, and happy Halloween! It's probable that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein took inspiration from the Renaissance concept of the homunculus, a miniature, alchemically created person, but flesh golems in fiction may go back even further. Traditional golems are made from clay, because that's supposedly what Adam was made from, but Eve was made of rib, so by my reckoning lady golems should be made of bone china or something. That is, assuming, however, that the rib was still fundamentally a bone made from clay. If it underwent perfect and complete transmutation, then that would mean that Eve was a person constructed entirely from excised parts of at least one other and brought to life by divine magic, which arguably makes her the first ever flesh golem.